I'm going to start out by saying hello to everybody and thank you for being here, and to just give you a quick hit on why I'm supporting Brandon for the city council seat. Um, uh, so all of you, I think, are on my election email list or have been in the past. And Brandon and I have known each other for a while now. Brandon, what is it, like 10 years, I think, something like
Yeah,
that.
pretty much. Yeah. Well,
And really, I'm backing Brandon in this race because of what I've seen in those 10 years. And in particular, the way that I've seen him move with regard to supporting transparency in government and transformation of non-transparent systems, and of getting information to the people in as many ways and as the most accessible way possible to help us like activate ourselves as advocates for ourselves and our own interests in city government. So you all know that I get super nerdy with my emails, and I dig into like really nitty gritty stuff like judgeships. And Brandon's actually one of the few people I know who gets as who who gets as interested in that sort of nitty gritty stuff, and in particular in sharing the information that he has.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I've loved most about what Brandon has done with his work in New Kings Democrats, which if anybody's unfamiliar with New Kings Democrats, it's a political club in Brooklyn. But he's NKD has done a lot of what they call explainers, which are like, you know, places where you can get information about something that is really hard to understand, like for instance, how judgeship nominations happen. And when I've been doing my election emails, I've very, very frequently turned to Brandon and asked for his opinion and his knowledge on this kind of like nitty gritty issue. Um, and he has been incredibly generous with his knowledge because that's the guy he is. He's the guy who wants people to have more information. And he's the guy who wants to figure out a way to explain it so that we can all access it and actually be part of the system instead of being shut out by it, which is really what the system is designed to do. And put that together with the incredible work he's done on the ground to actually transform these systems. I don't even want to, if Brandon had $1 for every hour he spent in a county committee meeting, just patiently trying to navigate the insanity of that system for the benefit of all of us, he wouldn't need to do any campaign fundraising. It's slow work. It's really not sexy work, and is unbelievably essential work that he's been doing in that way. And that's the guy he is. He's the guy who wants access and transparency and who's willing to put his boots on the ground and spend the sometimes excruciating time trying to make it happen. I also want to shout out the work that he did on Occupy City Hall this spring. So that's the other part of why I'm backing Brandon. It's really rare that you find somebody who has the vision, like who's the visionary guy who can see how we can transform our systems, and who is also the like super nerdy technocrat who knows how to like actually move these levers of power. Usually you don't find that in the same person. Usually you find that in like the candidate and their chief of staff as a pair. But we actually have the amazing opportunity to vote for all of that in one guy. So those are some of the reasons that I'm backing Brandon in this race. And I'll turn it over to Brandon to just give a little intro of himself and tell you what he's about. And then we're going to spend most of our time answering questions.
well, thank you. That was an incredible introduction. I feel that is one of the best introductions I've ever had. And thank you. You have such a name within the political Brooklyn scene just from the work of those emails. And, I remember hearing about the person who does the email, and finding out, oh, who is this person? And I think, oddly enough, we got connected by another means, so I think it's, really fantastic the work you've been doing. And I think, you deserve a lot of accolades for that, of course. So I want to take credit for those emails. That was all you in the work you've been doing. to try and bring power to people through the system, and that is, important stuff. But yeah, so I'll talk a little bit, I guess, about my story. I, moved around a little bit as a kid, but both my parents were teachers, and I grew up mostly in northern New Jersey. Their families from Jersey City and Newark, and bounced around a bit. But I've been in Park Slope for the last like 12 years almost. Um, I'm actually being evicted from my apartment right now because my landlord sold the building. So I found out 2 weeks ago. So I'm looking for places. Hopefully we'll find something, but that's case in point. Displacement is real. It is not just a policy thing I'm talking about, but something I'm directly experiencing. Um, but yeah, I guess my life story is really, my background is as a voting rights organizer. I wanted to do that since I was young. I got, was a nerdy person and started learning about student government and politics very early on and got involved in the political campaign since high school. And from kind of from the left side of things, I kind of got introduced to politics from a leftist point of view and kind of stayed there. And then I saw the rest of the country kind of get closer to meeting me a little bit in some ways. It was very lonely at the very beginning, but it was a lot of committee meetings and trying trial by fire and organizing on campuses and seeing what sticks, and but I knew I wanted to do is kind of build power for black and brown communities through our democracy. So how do you get people access to power? How do how do you get people to access to the vote through the systems that exist and changing them? And that was just something I always was struck by as a kid and wanted to do as a career. So that was my plan. Then 2007 happened. Recession hit, and I essentially was like, all right, I'll go to grad school. So I got a master's of public administration and figured we'd be done afterwards, but we weren't. So the recession kept going, and a door opened up working within the city. So I took a government budgeting class. Didn't think it would be where I'd end up, but it was interesting, and a job opened at OMB, which is the Office of Management Budget in the city. So I started working for the city, and OMB is it's a very interesting place to see the work, and it's bureaucratic in all its extremes, and I think how information was withheld even within government operation, like entities within House Council doesn't really understand how the budget's moved around and how money is kept in very vague, buckets in order for it to be moved around later in the cycle. And just seeing how the city operates from that vantage point was just really eye-opening. And it was also kind of draining. I didn't feel I was really directly impacting people's lives, from that vantage point. So I was like, all right, in the evenings when I leave, my job, I'm going to invest in political work. And because that was what really got me going in high school and college. And that, was when I started getting more involved in Democratic Socialists of America, but more in particular, the New Kings Democrats. And that was, came to a meeting, and I remember the first meeting was in the bottom of a now defunct co-working space in Williamsburg. And there's a bunch of Obama organizers just hanging out, passing around free PBR. And, Debbie Medina came down. And Debbie Medina ran against Delon, in the local race, and was just a really cool organizer from community of color. And there were other, candidates of color who were in that space. And they talked about county committee, and it was like, this is how the Democratic Party works in Brooklyn. And, and it explained how ridiculously opaque it is. And I don't need to go into a whole story about Vito Lopez and the whole history of the Brooklyn Democratic Party, but it is whatever you assume it is, and it is worse than that. And it's based off of, the vestige of the transactional nature of politics, and how we'll give you this judge sheet if you do this, or you appoint my, spouse to this position. And, it's just how people associate with politics, and it's been normalized. And as this is the last version of this still going on today. And that got me really, motivated. And I was never a person who ever saw myself running for office or getting really involved. I just really cared a lot about doing the work with people. And this was just a thing that really connected to me because, people don't know how to navigate systems. And in particular, people don't know how to navigate politics. And it feels separated, but really bad politics creates bad policy. And it really has an echoing effect in terms of what's possible and what gets done behind closed doors. It always goes back to the political structures. And people don't know how they work, and people don't know how to leverage them. And we were stuck when we have a result that we don't want, but don't know how we got there. And I wanted to like really unearth like how we get to these positions, how do we get to these situations through NKD. So it was a lot of explaining to people. We created a thing called Rep Your Block, which was to get more people on county committee to change the structure of and change the rules of the Democratic Party in itself, which was an effort. It took a lot of money and resources and time, but over the years, people began to understand what it is. And I think it's something where there's now articles where you couldn't get an article placed no matter how hard you tried. Now it's something that the local news cycle will cover because people are seeing it. People got engaged post 2016 and the landscape has changed. And this is something I feel I really identify because it's not just, the gatekeeping that happens in politics is, I think, something that really negatively impacts the work, what's possible. And I think, you're really trying to bring power to folks for them to advocate for themselves, as opposed to trying to solve through representative democracy, solve everyone's problems. There's no way to really do that work as an individual, but you can build power for people with people. And I think that's like the way to go forward. And that's something that like I started to identify with. And over time, um, I thought there would be a voice in politics. People would come to me and be like, "Hey, you ever think about running for office?" And I turned down a couple of different times. There were races where people suggested that I run, and I was like, "There's always someone in the community I think could do a better job of it." Because I grew up responding no to things more quickly than responding yes to things, and it's just a reflex of growing up. And we can talk about the whole experience and why maybe that's the case. But in 2018, though, we ran a slate through NKD of people against the party leadership, which doesn't really ever happen. And the boss at the time, Frank Sedio, doesn't really use a phone. So if you want to talk to him, you have to go to his club in Canarsie, and physical club where people hang out on Thursday night, and you get on a list of paper to speak to him, and he sits on an elevated platform with a sign that says the boss behind him. And you essentially have to kiss the ring in order to talk to him about if you want a job or a political deal or something. It's the weirdest place in the world. There's like, wood paneling, smells like smoke, all these framed pictures of politicians. And one day we just showed up with a box of cannolis and we're like, "Hey, here you go. By the way, we're running a slate of people against your leadership for the first time in the modern era." And didn't think it was a big deal. And then I found out it was a bigger deal than I thought afterwards. Because they sent people throughout the community to take people's proxy votes, because the meetings are run by proxy votes because there's so many empty seats that they fill with people. A lot of people don't even know they're on, and they farm those proxies in order to control the meeting. So they sent people pretending that they were connected to New Kings Democrats to get their proxy votes. Every single political leader was getting called by the party boss, and to the point that they sent a mailer, including one in some neighborhoods that had my fake name and signature on it saying, "Brandon West suggested you give your proxy vote to Frank Sedio." And they mailed this to like 1,000 people, who were on the county committee. And it was, just for positions that didn't have a ton of power, but it was a threat in some ways to the power structure that they had. So we had, they had a meeting, it was like 5 o'clock on a weeknight in Manhattan Beach, and we got 1,000, like a little less than 1,000 people in a room, and it took 2 years of organizing to get this done. And they still found a way to kind of thwart us and not let the rules get passed. So that was a turning point for me, just in terms of like how these political structures work, and kind of got me more, consistent with the idea that there's a story here, connecting the dots. And when this is like divorced from everything that's going on in this country, everything that happened in 2020, everything else, which is this reality that people do not have power. Government is veering further and further away from people's interest because of these opaque systems, either it be not understanding how the budget works, having the legislators kind of be gatekeepers, the siloing, like politically, incrementalism, and the party politics. And all these things are creating this environment where not only people don't have power, we don't know how to change it through any form of leveraging anything. And that was the point where I felt that there was a story here and a narrative that I think I can speak to differently, and maybe consider running for the city council race, because there's a lot that can be done in the city even though everyone talks about the state, there's actually a lot of things that still matter, mainly through the budget. And the budget is a reflection of the values of the city. And the budget is the thing that just happens behind the scenes. Most even council members don't even understand a lot of the debates within the budget cycle when it happens. And I think we can talk a little bit more about either different parts of this, but this is, I think, a real moment, just because I like had a launch event, didn't really do a whole lot, and then did a birthday event, and then pandemic hit, and then I completely pivoted to doing racial justice organizing after the George Floyd protests start, which led to the Occupy City Hall group that I was a part of and helped organize. But everything that happened last year, I think, validated my concerns and my thoughts about sort of how the city really responds in a time of crisis, which is it was completely on the backs of the most marginalized. That was the entire experience, at least from what I saw, what happened last year. And we're not in any position to really change that, without a fight, without a real mobilization of people's political power and will, and not just be on one thing, but really on changing systems that create this dynamic, and that I think is like the missing piece to the work, which I think is to have a city that is reflective of people's needs and cares and interests, So that I guess is like, the reflection point for me about why this council race I think matters, just because we're gonna have a new mayor, new speaker, 36, I think, council seats are gonna be open. This is, if we were going to do this well, this would be the time, and we're at the most crisis that we've been in a very long time. So I think this is like the moment to really not take off the foot off the gas in terms of the kind of changes you want to do at like a deep systemic way, on top of how do we incrementally fill the gaps that we have right now. So that's sort of my thinking, but I'm happy to go into questions and go from there.
Before we get into questions, there's a thing that you just said, Brandon, that I want to make sure doesn't get lost, which is I heard you say you were working on your city council campaign, and then George Floyd got murdered and you pivoted to working on the Occupy City Hall project. And I want to be clear that actually that actually shows very much what I've experienced of you in terms of how you move politically, because what you did at Occupy City Hall was you helped like actualize a vision of a different kind of city. And to me, like, I can't imagine a stronger campaign statement than the work that you did there, and what that activism represented in terms of a vision for a different kind of city where everyone is cared for and no one is left behind. And that really, I mean, I'm just going to go ahead and say, to me, it felt like Occupy City Hall was about leading with love. So in like with regard to how that is in context with your whole campaign, like Brandon just went ahead and lived it. He didn't talk about it. So I want to make sure that that part of things gets its airtime, to really see, like Maya Angelou said, when people tell you who they are, listen to them. Brandon told you who he was. So with that, I'll say, welcome to Boo. I'm glad you made it. Boo, this is my friend Brandon. Brandon, this is my friend Boo. And we've got questions from folks, and folks have already started in when we were waiting for folks to arrive. Folks already had questions. So I want to just jump right in. We had a question about how you maybe this is, since we're talking about Occupy, maybe it would be good to go in on what Peter was asking about, how you bring folks in on defund police who aren't already on board, like how that's instrumental to actually getting that work done. Right? Is that a good summary, Peter, of what I heard you ask?
Yeah, and I mean, maybe one particular thing I was interested in is what you're seeing as you campaign, in terms of how to, have the broadest, most open-minded kind of discussion on that, and anyway, and basically just kind of taking into account both immediate needs and longer-term vision, and doing, but not kind of reducing it to one side or the other. What Jen said is a little crisper, but yeah, all that stuff.
Totally. Yeah. So I think, just to hit the Occupy City Hall for a bit, it was a group of just random Black organizers who just were like, we want to throw down and do some cool actions in New York, and let's just see what works. And some folks within the Vocal were really interested in this idea of an occupation, and then it snowballed into something way bigger than we thought it was going to be. But I think the whole point of that action was like, we needed to create the system we wanted now and show that that's viable. So, and it's also built off of the energy of the, Occupy Wall Street, where, it was a very different experience. But I think we had the hindsight of what that was to know that we needed to center a specific ask and keep that forward the whole time so it was tangible for people. But it was also incredibly hard. Like, we wanted to create a space that was safe for people, but didn't involve policing. And there were people coming there with trauma and other prior experiences, and we didn't have the resources. Like, it's not like we could have called 311 and expect that they wouldn't send the police, because we certainly didn't trust or assume that would happen, And I think it was a reflection of really what's going on in the city was at this small location, which is that we had people who were interested in creating a space, but not the resources in order to really do it. But I do think that we're in a completely different space right now about the idea. And I think, in the beginning of this campaign, I was really committed to like the idea of defund, and in particular, just from what I experienced there, including police violence that was very traumatizing for me directly. This was something I was really committed to. But of course, the campaign is trying to weigh its concerns. So we were just like, oh, how are we going to talk about defund? Are we going to hedge it at the beginning and kind of use a different phrase? I was like, let's do phones and let's talk to folks and just say defund the police and fund our communities and talk about what we want to do with the money. And that has worked. By and large, like everyone we talk to in the 39th is supportive of defunding the police and funding our community. And if you can say defund it and refund, or you can say defund the police and reallocate funding to social services, or however you spin it, as long as you explain what you want to do, it resonates with people because people get it. And I think that's because people woke up really and saw what happened. We listened to the helicopters throughout the night. We saw the protests. We saw the police response. I think people know that, we're seeing things, violence, things we associate with crime as a result of, communities being underserved for so long. I think that is not a radical, that is not even really a leftist belief anymore. So I think the idea really resonates with folks. So we haven't seen much pushback, and people get stuck with the word, but if you pair it up with what you actually want to do, then there's nothing to be confused about. Even if you don't like the word, you understand like the response and like the point of it. So I think, I know other folks who are running in other races talk about the issue. I think 39th is like the most open to it than I think any of the other council districts. And I think that's something that I'm trying to run on and lean into as much as I can, because I think, it connects to so many other issues. Like this is, defund in reality is a Black liberation conversation. And I think the answer to that is like Black liberation is all people's liberation. Like if we center the righting the wrongs of, racism and, sexism and, ableism and all these forms, like we will meet the needs of our entire society and be centering that. So I think that, centering this phrase and Black Lives Matter as like a mantra, an ideal into government, I think is a thing that will impact everybody. And that's what I try and say to people. And I think people get that and people understand that. It just takes like a little extra like wording to like add to it. But I think defunding the police is something that is not something we can't say because it's too controversial. I think we really reached a point where we've changed the political landscape enough.
Thanks, Brandon. KJ, you want to go ahead?
Well, I just wanted to ask a question, just my own ignorance. What is the role of a city council person? Like, what do you do?
Totally. We're working on a thing for our website that just explains it in common sense terms. I will say the biggest parts of a council member is what you do is land use. So when there's land use changes in the district, you have a major vote in that process. It's the budget. So you have the budget is negotiated between the mayor's office and city council, so through the speaker. But every July 1st is like the new financial year. fiscal cycle, and fundings of agencies through the budget is a major part of that, but also committee shifts. So the speaker picks committees for council members to be on. So you're essentially focused on the operation of a city agency or a group of city agencies through that committee. So if you want to change how a committee's operating or behavior of the Parks Department or behavior of the school, the Department of Education, then you, in your role as a committee leader, can help have a hearing on a topic and then craft legislation based on that. So then you're pretty much trying to build legislation on different things within the purview of the city charter, which is our version of Constitution. So that's like those are the major buckets. There's also the soft power that happens within the council and being brought into community issues all the time. But I think those are like the core things where if we want to affect change, these are the levers that we have access to. And there's different reasons why some of those levers have worked more than others, depending on the political landscape.
KJ, did you want to ask your larger question or your other question?
Yeah, I do. I hear it in some of what you're saying, Brandon, already, but how the pandemic has created another way of us existing, and how are we to proceed as the pandemic starts, as more people are vaccinated, as social distancing will probably start to abate. How do we not forget the value of what we've learned and not just move back into like rushing into our lives again? And I mean, I think the principles that you're bringing up are really, we can't leave those behind at all. I mean, I think those are really essential. But I wonder about that in terms of the life and the health of the city, like people rushing to just run back into commerce and, forgetting about who we are as people that we maybe learned about. I mean, that's a personal thing that I want to remember. So, yeah.
No, I think that's a very real point. I mean, I think my block, we started doing a sing along every week, and the mutual aids have been popping up. I think people have tried to fill a gap that government was been purposely not funding itself to be able to do, which is like keep society together, in some way, and I think that we've seen in the last year that the city cannot do, basic services in terms of like feeding people and getting people access to healthcare. These are just things that government is like not capable of doing. NYC Care is like not a big enough stopgap to get people insurance, and the city cannot, provide good quality food without red tape to enough people, which is why the mutual aids and the soup kitchens have had to fill in that. And I was actually at Brooklyn Relief Kitchen recently, and they were just talking about the experience of the work that they're doing, and they need to find a new location. But essentially, it is that like they can't do what they're doing forever, and it's very, very, very challenging. But they show up, and they bring meals to a location for like mostly undocumented folks, and there's like 500 people lined up beforehand. Still, and this is a reality. But like, when do you see the political impact of folks who are on the margins, particularly undocumented folks? Like you don't see them. They're like invisible because they don't have PTAs that they can go to. They don't know those council members' phone number that they can just like ring up, in the same way. They don't have political clubs, that they can kind of will power through, and that is, we need to kind of recreate those things. So I think coming out of this, we absolutely have to mandate ourselves, mandate as a city that we have, people's basic needs to be filled, which means we need to house people who make under $35,000 because the market does not build housing for these people. We've tried every other market-based model that just does not work. And we've seen it work in Europe, Vienna, we've seen European cities kind of post World War II realize that we just have to create housing for people, and it can look good and it can be nice and be well funded and not cost a lot to make. But I think, this is all a political will conversation, because I think you ask people like, do you support housing people who are, housing insecure people say yes. If you start having, ample amounts of food for people who are dealing with hunger, people say yes. So it's not that people don't want these things, it's that we don't have the political will to do these things because there's always a market-driven thing on the other side of that, which prefers it not to be. And that again goes back to like the politics of sort of how things happen or don't happen. So I think we need to kind of create new political structures really to kind of like push back on these things, because we also haven't had a real left-leaning council, because the current council got into office before the Trump election bump. So we technically have a council that has been insulated from the investment of activism that's happened in the last 4 years. So this will be the first council that has been including that. So I feel, to get to, a city that is learned from the prior experiences, I think we do need a lot more political will. And in all honesty, outside of I think one mayoral candidate, the mayoral candidates are kind of giving us a slightly different version of what we've had before, as opposed to something that is really transformative, because of, real estate hasn't gone away. The other, the police unions are still here. That political power is still, it's sitting there, So I think, I think that's really what we kind of need to get to this, but it's not convincing people of the policy ideas. It's not convincing people of how we should treat each other. I think people agree on this. It's just that we haven't changed the political systems enough to make it easier for elected leaders to support these things, because all these other the other side is still there.
I had a follow-up question that I want to ask before I forget it, which you actually, I think, pretty much answered, but I've been renting in Park Slope for 21 years now. So I've watched the neighborhood really change a lot as my equity has not grown. And I was curious about, I think you answered this already, but what are the mistakes that the city council has made in the past to let that happen?
Well, there was this big, what year was this? Essentially, there was a piece of legislation that that council voted on that gave, essentially gave away a lot of its rights and changing like rent. It made a lot of rent-related regulations state issues as opposed to local issues, and that essentially like cast a die in terms of a lot of these issues. Once they became state things, they became next to impossible to really change, very easily. I can't remember what the name of it, but it'll come to me. But yeah, I think that was like the major turning point. But it's also it's been, the state has also wanted to keep New York within a boundary, because all state issues are really like what funding is not coming from the state, even though the federal government's giving it to the state to give to the city, and what part of that comes to us is a big part of the politics of Albany. And I think that we can fund alternatives to this, but it requires, again, a lot of political will, because like we can fund NYCHA. Like there's nothing stopping us from funding NYCHA, except that we don't have enough revenue, but also we don't have a political will, because we have to spend billions of dollars on our police budget and other things, and subsidies for luxury buildings that don't really create an influx of affordable housing as we said it would. So I think that is like 421A was a disaster. Mandatory inclusionary housing has not had the intended effect, and these are all legislations that have been passed that we've been trying to like shoehorn incrementalism through, but the models that work are the models that work. Like a basic good can't be a commodified item and we expect it to be available to people. It's just, and I feel like we've just seen that in so many places. So I think to get this the other direction, what we can do is we can have a charter revision process, because the city council can like elect to have a charter revision process, and you can have a commission to do it. And I think we should be changing our land use processes through it. And I think one is a comprehensive citywide plan, which is essentially we have goals citywide to meet certain needs in terms of like housing and accessibility and like healthcare. And rather than doing a rezoning here, yes or no, rezoning here, yes or no, which then gets bogged down in like the political dealings, we have a goal of X amount of housing, X amount of hospitals, X amount of whatever, and then that has to be created over a period of time. but you have to pair that up with something that involves the community, because you could have the same thing happen with no one being in the room, or community not being in the room in part of those conversations. So we need to create an office of community planning, which is something that there's been some research done, and Pratt has put out a long time ago, like a real long piece on it, which is essentially like how to have regular community engagement in planning decisions that is actually substantive, which I think is a really important piece to how do we change land use, which is how do we engage people. It's because we need a counterweight to the city planning, because city planning is always going to do what the mayor wants to do. So you have city planning, and you have the mayor in the room, and then you have the council member. So who's talking to the council member for years leading up to rezoning? These are the developers generally, even if they're nonprofit developers. These are folks who have a vested interest in getting this project over the finish line, and city planning is trying to guess what developers are going to be okay with, and like not go beyond that line what they think is going to be okay with. And then so then you get stuck with MIH projects, which are like 70% luxury, but they're 30% affordable, and then that's the like, that's the the benefit of it, and it keeps there being affordable housing prices, so I think that's how we get out of it, if we really have council focus on changing the rules in this way and funding creating housing for people. And I think it'll be a tough ask, because people just associate NYCHA as being unfixable, like we can't fix this, but I think this is really the long-term answer if we actually want to do it.
Can I pipe in with a follow-up, or somebody else have something on housing? And
I just, before I mute myself again, I want to just say I love that answer. And especially someone, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we're only cities with rent control, and the state, they did a statewide referendum to get rid of it. And that's the reason I moved to New York, because I was like, if I can't afford to live here, I might as well go somewhere else I can't afford to live. So I love that answer of giving it back to the local people is absolutely the way to do it. So thank you.
Hang on, Peter. Boo actually has a question that I feel like is a nice related. Jessica, do you need to leave, or you want to go after Boo?
Yeah, no, I was gonna tie into other stuff. Yeah, that was just happening.
Is your thing still on housing specifically?
Well, it's in response to what Brandon just said. So
yes, and then I'll come to you, okay?
Yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say, I think one, that it would be good to hear, your thoughts in that context about the Gowanus rezone. But also, and I can't believe I didn't actually think of this before, but there's proposal for Intro 1620, which is the 5-borough resiliency plan, dealing with coastal resilience, because of course we don't look at things holistically in the city, and everything is Manhattan centric. And as you were talking, Brandon, it just occurred to me that like putting that like Office of Community Planning and like rezoning and development into the context of the climate resilience planning as well really needs to be happening, right? Like this is like something I was saying after Sandy, like, over and over again, like if we're talking about, we need to be talking about fossil fuels, climate, housing, community, peripheral community issues, like all the physically peripheral, community issues, all those kinds of things at the same time. Otherwise, you're always sort of like leaving one piece out of the puzzle. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and like tying those pieces together, because obviously as we look to change what housing looks like in this city to make it more responsive to the needs of human beings, it has to also be responsive to the needs that are going to be in constant flux because of the way the climate is moving.
Yeah, totally. Real quick, I think it's completely insane, but very much a New York thing, that we're dealing with one of the largest rezonings in the lowest level elevation in Brooklyn without any real comprehensive plan on resiliency. It's crazy, that this is the case, and I think that, I think this is like an incredibly important piece of the puzzle of doing this work, because like, we're going to be impacted by it, and, developers, as we know, are like, when you have a profit motive, and then you're gonna cut corners, and or just blatantly not do things that are part of the requirement, because you can probably beat out the city in the laws, on the legal battle, on these things. So yeah, I think this is incredibly important, and I think we need a lot of power at the top in order to like really push for this kind of thing, because I think we can't we're going to need the mayor, and like we do have some good legislation that's been passed that we're going to be following up on. But I think, you know, to get something that big, we really need a lot of support. Brad Lander recently called me jokingly YIMBY socialist, which is I disagree with in some ways, you know, because like I am not blatantly against the rezoning and the concept of we shouldn't be building housing for people. Like I agree we should be building housing for people. We shouldn't be building housing this way for people. And it's easier to just be blatantly for or blatantly against something. And when I'm trying to like thread this like wonky middle ground of like, here's what's wrong with this, but I don't want to not do anything because that is not the answer either, you know. And it's again like running for office. I've learned like it is nuance does not work really well at times when you're trying to make a message with someone you don't have a lot of time to talk to explain something to them. But I think that's really the answer with the rezoning is that like, yeah, we need to build housing for people. We need to build more affordable housing for people, and we need to not do it the way that's in this rezoning, you know. And that is generally the message that I've been communicating to folks.
Boo, you wanted to ask sort of a bigger picture question that ties into some of these questions about profit motives. And I just want to make sure nobody else has a like a specific pointy housing question before we move on from housing. All right, go for it, Boo.
But mine is housing specific, but I think it sounds like it'll follow from what Boo said. So I'll hold if that's
Let's see. Hi, everybody. Sorry I was late. Meetings. Hey, Brandon, good to meet you. So this is, as Jen mentioned, a quite broad question. And I'm wondering if you are seeing increased awareness because of the pandemic of how capitalism is not serving us. And is there discussion in the circles that you move in on how to keep that awareness once the pandemic ends and ideally move awareness to action? Then if so, what kind of action can be taken in a city built on the financial sector? I know that there is a cluster of 6 bills coming up for vote on April 1st, the Invest in Our New York Act, which will do a lot of good if they're passed. But to the big picture of, in that they'll tax a lot of the financial transactions and they'll tax the rich. But is this awareness of how capitalism is killing us growing as you see it, as you've experienced the discussions in your circles?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something that I've kind of feel DSA has done really a really strong job of like trying to build that narrative and keep it going with the slate of like leaders they have in Albany and how they're like all working collaboratively to keep those messages forward. And like there's a coalition, but like DSA is picking up a lot of like, you know, work in terms of the, you know, the tax rich campaign as they call it, and like this effort. I'm talking to folks about it. They feel good about 2 of the bills, which is something, but it's not 6, and we need all 6. And I feel politically all 6 don't seem radical at all to me to do all of them, but especially with supermajorities, you know. But I think that, yeah, I think it's difficult because the city is very much like the physical manifestation of capitalism, you know, in the world. And like, some of the previous mayors have realized that we needed to make it a more than one sector city. And I think you can give Bloomberg whatever amount of credit you want to give, but he did try to make it, you know, the city for, you know, film industry and the city for new tech, you know, and like tried to like diversify it a little bit. And I think that, you know, we've let the manufacturing jobs leave the city. And there's been like ramifications for that, but I think that is like what needs to be done in general still to try and build like a more robust new economy, just because when, you know, the financial meltdowns have happened, it's hit the city incredibly hard, you know. And, you know, I know that this is the kind of thing that happened in Philadelphia because Philadelphia was, you know, a one industry city for a long time. And then they had that happen too. And then they essentially tried to keep as many college educated people to stay in the city in order to rebuild it and create other industries. And so I think that's what we're going to still need to do in New York. But I think to do like this larger conversation of like, how do we centered a realization that, like capitalism is failing everyone. And I think it's, I think it's coupling the political organizing that needs to be done and community-based building organizing to make sure that, we can get the legislative goals accomplished. And I think that we can't have Chuck Schumer in a completely different place and try to expect to get the federal support that we need in order to fund the things that we need to do. So it connects to, again, this like political conversation about like how do all these things interact with each other. But like I know that last year for Occupy, some city council offices got like 40,000 phone calls and emails. It was like by magnitudes of multiple times the most they've ever heard from their community. And I know that some, particularly like the Black and brown legislators in Central Brooklyn, that it didn't matter because they were going to listen to the clergy or the tenant leaders that they are closer to. Like it didn't matter how many emails they got, but they were going to talk to those folks to decide how they were going to, go on this. And it's like, okay, so we need to do more work in order to like engage with those players. But I think that is going to matter because we're going to get to the end of this like push for these, these bills, and we'll see how successful we are. But I still feel that like, we got to be in a position where it's literally politically impossible not to do it. And I think that is really like how we get, democratic control to our politics and our economy to actually happen is by, building a mass movement, and I think that requires that kind of work. And but I do, again, like, I feel I'm repeating myself, but I feel that like, this is politically where people are now. Before, if this was like 6 years ago, 4 or 6 years ago, I'd be talking about like, how do we get this message to work for people and like spread it out? But I don't think we have to do that anymore, and I think that like last year kind of crystallized a lot for people, so yeah, I think, also people are afraid to say what they feel, in terms of like the politics of this. Like people know that people are abandoned, but people don't, we say that any development is good development. That is just something that's baked in our head, by the fact that from all the different places that we hear and feel and see these things, and that we can't question sort of like, well, how is this increasing equity and access, and I think that it's like really pushing people to really feel that we can have that conversation and like we can change it, and I think that there's no real there's like one button in order to kind of like have an awakening in terms of this issue. But I think it's a lot of like the base building and building the ground, and also just like being able to say the word socialist, to people, and be able to say criticize capitalism openly. I think that's an important part. And I was a person who originally was just like, why do we gotta, can't we just like code switch, and like, just do what we need to do? And then over time, I realized, no, we actually have to say that word, and we have to like, call people comrade and talk about unions and like, because this stuff is actually super important to creating an alternative system. So I'm kind of like more on the like drink the Kool-Aid kind of side of things, because I do feel that this is like actually a part of why we can't do it, is because we've kind of taken all the power out of the language and the culture of the left, and I think that is like an intentional thing at the right, and capitalism is done. So.
Yes. One quick follow-up question. Which are the two bills that you're hearing positive movement on, if you don't mind?
Oh, all the numbers are kind of gobbledygook in my head. Give me a second. It was like someone said something like to me in passing. Can't quite remember exactly which ones. If I see a list of them, I can probably tell you which ones. But give me a second.
Yeah, if we're short on time, never mind.
Okay.
Let's maybe get that a follow-up from Brandon for you. I want to, it's 7:27, so I want to do two things. I want to give folks a graceful moment to exit, if now's the time for you to do that. And I'd like to take like 5 more minutes to do like a lightning round with you, Brandon, because I'm hoping that folks who are on my email list, I've recorded this meeting, and folks who are on my email list, I'm hoping will have the opportunity to watch it. So there's a couple of issues I want to make sure Brandon touches on before we finish. So I'm going to say what those issues are so that you all can decide if you want to stay for another extra couple of minutes. so Brandon, I would love to hear you talk very briefly about your approach to constituent services, because we've been talking big picture and policy, but like the other half of city council ship is just like making sure the potholes get fixed. So, and all that represents. So constituent services, I'd love to hear you talk about your understanding of the immigrant populations in the district and the diversity of languages in the district, and how access can be shaped around language justice. And I would love to hear you talk briefly about your understanding of what you feel like you can do for seniors in the district. And I didn't send those to you in advance. So if I don't want to put you on the spot and all of that.
No, this is great. I'm happy to talk about these things. Okay, so is this quick answers or just as quick as I can give answers?
Yeah, let me just, before we go into that, does anybody need to hop off, or can everybody stay like another 5-7 minutes? Okay, I'm gonna take that as yes.
I want to hear all that stuff. That's good stuff.
That's kind of why I teased it first. All right, cool. So go for it, Brandon.
Okay, great. So constituent services, it's incredibly important. I feel with legislators, you see that there's a shifting. Usually you do more of one and less of the other in terms of like legislative work and power building and constituent services. And then, I think that, you have to, essentially you have to do this work. This is like too important. So particularly now, because people just go out and reach out to folks without an understanding. So I think I've worked very briefly in actually Bobby Carroll's office, just as like an office person for a little bit in between jobs. And people just walk into the office and because they had issues. Mainly, a lot of it was housing related. Their like mother or grandmother was like going to get evicted. They didn't know where to go to. They didn't know how to have the access to the information. And I think to do constituent services, you need to physically be where people are. You can't assume that people will come to you. And that is like the whole model of how I will frame it is people from marginalized communities will need to be represented in that the office. But then it's also, community groups and, other major players need to be constant conversation with, so that means office hours in the southern part of the district. It doesn't hear from you as much. It means being present, in a lot of different, community organizations and activities and events throughout, just because people see you, and then you can be a reference point for access to information. And then it's obviously being able to like condense and get that information and present it to people. Like there's people who still don't understand, where they can get tested for COVID or where they can, get a vaccine. It's complicated even for people who are have a lot of information. So what you can imagine if you're, struggling and, don't have access to Wi-Fi, you're completely in the dark, So I think in terms of how I address it, it would be, hiring the right people who represent the different parts of the district, not particularly the ones who are like, have most political capital and access, and then, trying to be physically present as well as like digitally present in as many different communities as possible and regularly. And that means like monthly events. Like if there isn't a big open event a month for a legislator, I think you're not doing nearly enough community outreach, and I think that is like a bare minimum. You're doing town halls or a version of that in some part of your district every month, every 4 weeks, so I'd want to do it every 2 at a minimum, so I think that is with Zoom, maybe it's easier to do, it's harder to find an event space and do it. I think, it's just time and it's too important to do, so that I think is like my approach to constituent services. And I think it would be like hiring people done it already, I think everything's relationships anyway. And I think that, hiring people who have those relationships is like very important to me. So I think that is like the best way to do that work well, is to like talk to folks who've already done it, and bring them in and kind of think, all right, what worked, what hasn't worked, how can we do this differently? And how can we, center folks? So that's one. I think this actually connects to the other. It actually connects to all of them really, in terms of like diversity of, language and language access. Language access is one of the like under communicated challenges I feel in terms of like government and opportunity. That if you don't speak English, you will just never be able to navigate 311. You can forget about it. 311 is like not not accessible to you if you don't speak English, because it is nightmarish in terms of like what I've seen in terms of people trying to use it. Because a lot of times you'll have a responder who does not speak even Spanish, and they'll be reading off of a list, and so you have a sort of non-native speaker trying to read, a phonetic version of like directions to you. It's just not available to folks, and I think that particularly in the southern part of your district, actually after Spanish, I think Yiddish is the third most spoken language because of the Borough Park. That small part of Borough Park is actually enough people that it exceeds South Asian languages, which is interesting. But I think that particularly in South Slope, the part really close to to Sunset Park and in Kensington, you have like language access is real because you have the compounding effect of folks who are undocumented, but then you have like the digital divide. So you have students at home, folks being required to work at home but don't have the resources to be able to do that at home. So I think you have to our agencies do a horrible job of translating information for folks because they're just not centering that work, and I think that you really have to either find some like overarching model to centering that work for all the agencies, because they're not going to do it themselves. They're going to do it the wrong way. And I know so many people have to like retranslate things for their community because the city gives them a really bad version of something that's not accessible to folks, So I think that that's real. And I think that like, it's because the city also doesn't really engage well with immigrant-led organizations for the most part. They kind of like they go it alone a lot of the time. So I think in order to fix this, we have to center either with every appointment of a head of an agency, like language justice, like very head on, or assume that it's not going to happen and create an alternative to be able to do that. So that's, either in the community trying to retranslate and recommunicate what's coming from the agencies, or just like creating an alternative like thing that does this well. And then for seniors, I think that, it is also a very untalked about thing on the horizon about, the aging population and a lot of folks who just, don't have access to, resources, and also like have mobility issues and challenges. And I think that, we have to kind of, it's more than just throwing money at Department of Aging, Department of Seniors, because I think that's like important. They do have a very small budget in relation to a lot of city agencies, but I think it's also, I think, more of like a holistic way of like how do we approach community needs, and the way to do that, I really feel is, I guess you kind of have to kind of do like a census, really, a kind of a real deep canvas of community building with where people are, because there's no one thing you can do to kind of like really meet the needs of the senior community, because there's a lot of different challenges. Like there is housing insecurity, and there's like healthcare, and there's like digital divide, and language access as well. So you kind of have to do this like the block by block work of trying to talk to folks and see where they are and try to connect them to where they need to be. And I think that is, you can only do like deep base building from being somewhere and doing it over a period of time. And I think some of that the council office can do, but like some of the council office really can't do, because you're not going to get access to people, your foot in that door, So yeah, I think is like other important players in the community can do that even outside of community organizations. But I think these are where those community and membership organizations do a whole lot, like Make the Road and other groups can do, because they know these folks, they've seen these folks for years, and they know how to reach out to them. So I think instead of getting in front of them, it's kind of like supporting them. And this is where the discretionary budget for city council comes, where you can start to give money for projects for groups within the community to do certain things. And I think that is where like a really important piece of funding is to support groups who are doing the outreach to seniors already, and already know these folks. And it isn't something that the council needs to do from scratch.
All right, I'm gonna bring us to closure tonight. And first, I just want to thank you all, Peter and Boo and Jess and Abigail and KJ, who's gone now, I think, for taking your evening to get to know Brandon and to understand what your choices are in the city council and to just, you know, take hold of your power as a voter. So thanks, as I always say at the end of my emails, thank you for giving a shit. I love you for it. And Brandon, you know, I want to say thank you to you for taking your time tonight, and also just thank you for your years and years of work and for being a partner to me and for, you know, for fighting the good fight for us in whatever way is available to you as it becomes available to you. I'm going to drop in the chat real quick the Brandon's website. Let me get that here. So as you all know, city council campaigns are won and lost through donations, but also through volunteer effort. And if what you've heard from Brandon tonight makes you feel inspired to spend some time helping him support his campaign, there's a lot of work to be done right now. There's petitioning, which some of you may or may not have done. It's actually not that hard, but it's getting people to sign that green piece of paper to get him on the ballot. That needs to happen. And I'm sure, Brandon, do you want to say anything else about what you need volunteers for and how folks can plug in if they feel moved to do so?
Totally. There's so many different ways to plug in, and the easiest paths are really like the petitioning stage and phone banking, because we want to get our message to people and talk to people about what they care about, and that requires, you know, this kind of work. But also there's some folks who are just like, you know, I can't really, you know, I don't have, my schedule allows me to leave the home, but, you know, I can make phone calls for you and help call other volunteers to show up, you know, and that's even easier than calling random strangers, because these folks already said they want to join, you know, just, or pinging people or sending texts or, you know, doing postcards. There's a lot of different things that we could use help on. So if there is a particular thing, or a relationship, if you know someone who has, you know, potential office storefront that, you know, these are all the like smaller things that we can help with. But if you generally sign up to the volunteer link, someone will call you and just kind of be like, hey, what are you thinking about, you know, what you can do and like what's available, what's your capacity or interest, you know, and we'll definitely talk to you from there. So I think we could definitely use some help with the petitioning. Here are, can I show you, can I pull this off? All right, I'm going to show you all the petitions here in the office that we have ready for tomorrow. This is how we get on the ballot, and it's like a, you know, but it's also like how we get to talk to folks and, you know, see where they're interested. And this has been, you know, an important part. This is like the first real test of the campaign, and it's going really well, but could always use a little bit more support. So thank you.
It's a really nice week to be petitioning. The weather's going to be amazing. And I think like in Zoomiverse, a lot of us maybe need some reasons to get out of the house. So so maybe you can help out in that way. I'm going to wrap us up and just say thanks to everybody for being here, and you know, take good care and stay safe. And we're, you know, we've got the light at the end of the tunnel with this insanity of COVID. So keep yourself safe and be careful so that we can all make it to the end. All right. Good night, folks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, Brandon.
Bye.
Thank you.